Pennsylvania, September 3, 1943. Karl Richter's hands trembled as he held a physics textbook printed in flawless German, its pages crisp and unmarked, its contents more advanced than anything he had studied at the gymnasium in Stuttgart. The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows of Camp Indiantown Gap, illuminating rows of desks where 30 German prisoners sat in stunned silence, waiting for their first lecture on quantum mechanics from a professor who spoke their language with a Viennese accent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Lieutenant Richter of the Luftwaffe's 3rd Fighter Wing had expected to die in the burning cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the Mediterranean. Today, he sat in a temperature-controlled classroom designed specifically for prisoner education, surrounded by books, laboratory equipment, and teaching materials that represented an investment in enemy minds that defied every assumption he held about American priorities. The camp library contained over 12,000 volumes in German. The science laboratory featured equipment that rivaled university facilities in Berlin. The lecture hall held 200 seats with proper acoustics and blackboards that stretched the length of the room. "This cannot be propaganda," Karl wrote in the journal he had started keeping at the insistence of his American captors. "They have built us a university inside a prison camp. They teach us as if we matter, as if our minds have value beyond military intelligence. What manner of enemy invests in the intellectual development of captured soldiers?" The deception began the moment Karl stepped off the transport train at Indiantown Gap on June 17, 1943. He was part of the first wave of Luftwaffe officers captured during the North African campaign, men who had fought with distinction and expected treatment befitting their rank under the Geneva Convention. What they received exceeded the convention's requirements so dramatically that many prisoners initially suspected elaborate psychological manipulation designed to extract military secrets through kindness rather than coercion. Camp Indiantown Gap sprawled across 15,000 acres of Pennsylvania woodland, housing nearly 8,000 German prisoners behind wire fences that seemed almost apologetic in their simplicity. The commandant, Colonel Richard Winters, was a former professor of European history at Princeton University who spoke fluent German and had spent 2 years in Berlin during the 1930s studying the rise of National Socialism. His first address to arriving prisoners, delivered in accent-free German, set a tone that would define Karl's entire captivity. "Gentlemen," Colonel Winters announced to the assembled prisoners on that first afternoon, "you are here not merely to wait out the war, but to prepare for the peace that will follow. The United States government has authorized a comprehensive education program for prisoners of war who demonstrate intellectual capacity and genuine interest in learning. You will have access to university-level instruction, vocational training, and cultural enrichment that we hope will serve you well when you return to rebuild Germany." Karl had listened with the cynicism of a man trained to recognize propaganda. Education for prisoners was a luxury no rational military power would waste on enemy combatants. The resources required to teach thousands of captured soldiers could be better spent on weapons production, troop training, or civilian morale. Yet as the weeks unfolded, the education program revealed itself to be not a superficial gesture but a systematic investment in prisoner rehabilitation that operated on a scale and with a seriousness that challenged everything Karl understood about wartime priorities. The program began with assessment. During his first week at Indiantown Gap, Karl underwent 3 days of testing that evaluated his language skills, mathematical aptitude, scientific knowledge, and educational background. The tests were administered by German-speaking American officers who had been university professors before the war, men who approached the evaluation with academic rigor rather than military interrogation techniques. Dr. Robert Hartmann, a physics professor from Columbia University who had fled Berlin in 1938, conducted Karl's science assessment in a small office lined with books in both German and English. He asked questions that had no military application, problems in theoretical physics that served no intelligence purpose, mathematical challenges that revealed only the prisoner's capacity for abstract reasoning. "You studied engineering at Stuttgart," Dr. Hartmann observed in the refined German of an educated Berliner. "Your mathematics is excellent, but your physics education was interrupted by military service. Would you be interested in continuing your studies here? Karl had stared at the professor with incomprehension bordering on suspicion. Continue my studies? Here? In a prison camp? Dr. Hartmann smiled with the patient understanding of a teacher who had explained this concept many times before. We have authorization to provide university-level instruction in mathematics, physics, chemistry, engineering, languages, history, literature, and economics. Classes meet 6 days per week. Examinations are graded according to academic standards. Successful completion earns certificates recognized by American universities and potentially transferable to German institutions after the war. The explanation sounded like fantasy, like a fevered dream conjured by a mind desperate to escape the reality of captivity. But Dr. Hartmann produced a course catalog printed on heavy paper with professional typography, listing dozens of classes organized by subject and difficulty level. Introduction to Quantum Mechanics. Advanced Differential Equations. Organic Chemistry Laboratory. Comparative Literature of the Romantic Period. American Constitutional History. Each course description included prerequisites, required texts, and the credentials of the instructor. Karl chose physics because it represented the future he had abandoned when conscription interrupted his university education. He had completed 2 years of engineering studies before the Luftwaffe claimed him, transforming a student of theoretical problems into a pilot of practical destruction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony of resuming his education in an American prison camp while Germany fought for its survival was not lost on him, but neither was the opportunity to reclaim the intellectual life that war had stolen. His first class met on September 3rd in a building that had been constructed specifically for prisoner education. The classroom occupied the second floor of a structure that also housed laboratories, a library annex, and faculty offices for the civilian professors who taught in the camp. The desks were solid wood, not the folding metal chairs Karl had expected. The blackboards were clean and well maintained. The windows provided natural light supplemented by electric fixtures that eliminated the shadows where ignorance might hide. Professor Heinrich Müller, who had taught at the University of Vienna until the Anschluss forced his emigration to America, stood at the front of the room with the commanding presence of a man who had spent 30 years explaining complex ideas to skeptical students. He was 62 years old, white-haired, and spoke German with the precision of someone who believed language was the architecture of thought. Gentlemen, Professor Müller began without preamble, we will spend the next 16 weeks exploring the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics. This is not a survey course for casual students. I will expect you to master the Schrödinger equation, understand the principles of wave-particle duality, and grapple with the philosophical implications of uncertainty at the subatomic level. You will be examined rigorously. You will be graded honestly. You will be treated as university students, because that is what you have chosen to become. Karl opened his textbook to the first chapter and began reading about probability waves and the collapse of quantum states. The material was challenging, abstract, and utterly removed from the practical concerns of warfare. It was also the most intellectually stimulating experience he had encountered in 3 years of military service. For the next 2 hours, he forgot he was a prisoner. He forgot he was an enemy. He became simply a student again, wrestling with ideas that had no loyalty to any nation and no stake in the war's outcome. The transformation was disorienting. Karl had spent his adult life in service to National Socialist ideology, believing that individual intellectual development mattered only insofar as it served the state's objectives. Education in Germany had become increasingly militarized and politicized, with university curricula designed to produce engineers for weapons development and scientists for strategic research. The idea that education could exist for its own sake, that knowledge could be pursued without immediate practical application, contradicted everything his training had taught him about the proper relationship between individual and collective. Yet here in an American prison camp, captured enemy soldiers were being taught quantum mechanics, a field of study so theoretical that its applications remained largely speculative even to the scientists who developed it. The Americans were investing resources in prisoner minds not to extract military intelligence or advance propaganda objectives, but apparently for the simple reason that educated people were preferable to uneducated people regardless of their nationality or political allegiance. That evening, Karl sat in the camp library, a two-story building that housed 12,000 books in German along with periodicals, newspapers, and academic journals. The library had been stocked through a combination of American purchases, donations from German-American cultural organizations, and Red Cross acquisitions. The collection included classical literature, contemporary fiction, scientific texts, philosophical works, and historical studies spanning 5 centuries of German intellectual achievement. He selected a volume of Goethe's poetry and settled into a leather armchair that would have been at home in any civilian library. Around him, other prisoners read newspapers, studied textbooks, or simply sat in contemplative silence. The scene possessed a surreal normalcy that made Karl question the nature of his captivity. Was he truly a prisoner if he could choose his own books, pursue his own studies, and spend his evenings reading poetry while his countrymen died on distant battlefields? The question haunted him through the autumn of 1943 as he progressed through Professor Mueller's physics course. The lectures were intellectually demanding, requiring hours of study to master complex mathematical concepts. The laboratory sessions provided hands-on experience with equipment that allowed prisoners to verify theoretical predictions through experimental observation. The examinations tested comprehension with the same rigor that any university would apply to degree candidates. Karl discovered that he excelled at quantum mechanics in ways he had never excelled at aerial combat. His mind, which had struggled with the split-second tactical decisions required of fighter pilots, thrived in the contemplative environment of theoretical physics. He could spend hours working through a single equation, pursuing logical implications with the patience that academic work demanded. For the first time since his capture, he felt competent, valued, and intellectually alive. The other students in his class came from diverse backgrounds within the Luftwaffe officer corps. Dieter Vogel had been a bomber navigator with a degree in mathematics from Göttingen. Ernst Schmidt was a fighter ace who had studied philosophy at Heidelberg before the war. Wolfgang Bauer had worked as an engineer designing aircraft engines until his Messerschmitt was shot down over Tunisia. Each man brought different strengths to the classroom, and Professor Mueller encouraged collaboration rather than competition. In science, the professor explained during one lecture, truth is not established through victory but through verification. Your nationality matters nothing to the laws of physics. A quantum state behaves the same whether observed by a German or an American, a Nazi or a Democrat. This is why science offers hope for a world beyond war, because it reminds us that some truths transcend human conflict. The words carried a subversive power that Karl felt but could not immediately articulate. He had been taught that truth was whatever served the German nation, that facts were subordinate to ideology, and that intellectual inquiry should always support state objectives. But quantum mechanics cared nothing for National Socialism or American democracy. The Schrödinger equation worked the same regardless of who solved it. The uncertainty principle applied equally to all observers in all nations. If some truths transcended politics, if knowledge existed independent of ideology, then perhaps the intellectual framework that had justified the war contained fundamental errors. The thought was dangerous, almost treasonous, but it grew stronger with each passing week as Karl immersed himself in studies that owed allegiance only to evidence and logic. By November 1943, Karl had completed his first semester of quantum mechanics with marks that would have earned him distinction at any German university. Professor Mueller returned his final examination with a grade of 93% and a handwritten note in the margin stating that Karl's derivation of wave function normalization showed exceptional mathematical insight. The praise meant more to him than any military commendation he had received during his service in the Luftwaffe. But the physics course was only one component of the education program at Indiantown Gap. The camp also offered classes in English language instruction, American history, democratic political theory, and comparative economics. These courses carried a more explicit rehabilitative purpose, designed to introduce German prisoners to ideas and values that contrasted sharply with National Socialist ideology. Karl enrolled in an English course taught by Mrs. Eleanor Preston, a former high school teacher from Philadelphia who volunteered 3 days each week to work with German prisoners. She was 56 years old, patient, and convinced that language learning was the first step toward cultural understanding. Her classroom occupied a corner of the education building with windows overlooking the Pennsylvania hills that reminded Karl of the forests near his childhood home in Württemberg. Language is not merely vocabulary and grammar, Mrs. Preston told her students in carefully enunciated English during their first class. Language shapes how we think, what we notice, and what seems possible. When you learn English, you are not just acquiring a tool for communication. You are opening doors to different ways of understanding the world. The English classes met 4 times weekly, progressing from basic vocabulary to conversational fluency over the course of 6 months. Karl discovered that learning a new language required humility that military service had never demanded. He stumbled over pronunciation, confused verb tenses, and made grammatical errors that would have embarrassed him in his native German. But Mrs. Preston corrected mistakes with gentle encouragement rather than harsh judgment, treating errors as natural steps in the learning process rather than personal failures. By February 1944, Karl could conduct simple conversations in English, read newspaper articles with a dictionary's assistance, and understand perhaps 60% of spoken dialogue if speakers talk slowly. The progress felt simultaneously rapid and inadequate, impressive and insufficient. But Mrs. Preston assured him that language acquisition required time, patience, and willingness to make mistakes in pursuit of eventual mastery. "You are learning quickly," she told him after class one afternoon in early spring. "But more importantly, you are learning courageously. It takes courage to speak imperfectly, to risk sounding foolish, to accept correction from others. These are valuable skills that extend far beyond language study." Karl had never thought of language learning as courage, but he began to see Mrs. Preston's point. Every time he spoke English, he revealed ignorance. Every mistake exposed limitation. Every question admitted confusion. In the Luftwaffe, such vulnerability would have been weakness. In the classroom, it became the prerequisite for growth. The education program also included what the Americans called civic instruction, courses designed to introduce prisoners to democratic political theory and American constitutional principles. These classes walked a fine line between education and indoctrination, teaching concepts that directly contradicted National Socialist ideology while claiming to offer objective analysis of comparative political systems. Professor David Cohen, a political science instructor from Yale University, taught a course titled Foundations of Democratic Government that Karl enrolled in during the spring semester of 1944. Professor Cohen was 41 years old, the son of Jewish immigrants from Poland, and intellectually passionate about the ideas that had shaped American political development. His lectures combined historical analysis with philosophical argument, tracing democratic theory from ancient Athens through Enlightenment philosophy to modern constitutional practice. Democracy, Professor Cohen explained during the first lecture, is not simply majority rule. It is a complex system of competing powers, protected rights, and institutional checks designed to prevent any single faction from obtaining absolute authority. The American Constitution assumes that human beings are imperfect, that power corrupts, and that political systems must be designed to limit damage that flawed people can inflict when given unchecked authority. Karl listened with the fascination of someone encountering ideas that had been systematically excluded from his education. In Germany, he had been taught that democracy was weak, indecisive, and incapable of decisive action in times of crisis. The National Socialist critique of liberal democracy portrayed it as a system that elevated mediocrity, rewarded demagoguery, and failed to produce strong leadership necessary for national greatness. But Professor Cohen presented democracy not as weak but as deliberately constrained, not as indecisive but as carefully balanced, not as a failure of will but as a triumph of institutional design over the human tendency toward tyranny. The argument was intellectually compelling even to Karl's skeptical mind, though accepting it required abandoning assumptions he had held since adolescence. The spring semester brought Karl deeper into territory that challenged not just his knowledge but his fundamental worldview. Professor Cohen's course on democratic government required reading texts that had been banned in Germany since the early 1930s. John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. The Federalist Papers. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Each work presented arguments about natural rights, separation of powers, and limited government that contradicted everything National Socialist ideology proclaimed about the relationship between individual and state. Karl read Locke's assertion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and the words struck him with revelatory force. In Germany, he had been taught that individuals existed to serve the state, that government authority derived from historical destiny and national character, and that consent was irrelevant to political legitimacy. But Locke argued the opposite, that legitimate authority flowed upward from individual citizens rather than downward from autocratic leaders. The idea was intellectually elegant but practically troubling. If governments required consent, what happened when citizens disagreed about fundamental purposes? How could nations act decisively when every policy required broad popular approval? Wouldn't democracy descend into the chaos and paralysis that German propaganda had always predicted? Professor Cohen addressed these objections with the patience of a teacher who had heard them many times before. Democracy is messy, he acknowledged during a class discussion in April 1944. It is slower than autocracy, more contentious than dictatorship, and often frustrating to people who value efficiency above all else. But democracy's slowness is a feature, not a bug. The requirement to build consensus, to persuade rather than command, to compromise rather than dominate, these constraints prevent the catastrophic errors that unchecked power enables. Karl wanted to argue, to defend the German system that had mobilized an entire nation toward collective goals with efficiency that democracies could never match. But the argument died in his throat as he considered what those collective goals had produced. The war that was destroying Europe. The occupation policies that had brutalized conquered populations. The ideological fanaticism that had led millions of young men like himself to fight for objectives they had never questioned. Perhaps efficiency was overrated if it enabled efficient catastrophe. The thought felt like betrayal, like intellectual treason against everything he had once believed. But Karl could not unthink it once it had formed. The education program was doing exactly what it was designed to do, introducing alternative frameworks that made National Socialist ideology seem less like eternal truth and more like one flawed political theory among many. By May 1944, Karl had completed his second semester of physics and his first semester of political theory with marks that would have earned him academic honors at any university. But the real transformation was occurring not in his grades but in his questions. He had entered the education program as a convinced National Socialist who expected American instruction to be crude propaganda. He was emerging as someone who had begun to suspect that his own education had been the propaganda all along. The suspicion deepened during summer sessions when Karl enrolled in a course on European history taught by Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a historian from Bryn Mawr College who had written extensively about the origins of totalitarian movements. Dr. Sullivan was 53 years old, unmarried, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of 19th and 20th century European political development. Her lectures traced the intellectual and social currents that had produced fascism, communism, and liberal democracy as competing responses to the crises of industrial modernity. Totalitarian movements, Dr. Sullivan explained in her first lecture, arise when people become convinced that complex problems require simple solutions imposed by strong leaders. They promise order in place of chaos, certainty in place of doubt, and decisive action in place of democratic deliberation. They appeal to our desire for clarity, for belonging, for purpose larger than individual existence. And they always, without exception, produce catastrophe. Karl had never heard National Socialism described as a totalitarian movement comparable to Soviet communism. German propaganda had presented the two systems as opposites, with National Socialism representing order, tradition, and national strength, while communism represented chaos, internationalism, and class warfare. But Dr. Sullivan argued that the similarities outweighed the differences. Both systems concentrated power in single parties. Both eliminated political opposition. Both subordinated individual rights to collective goals. Both used violence against internal and external enemies to maintain control. The comparison disturbed Karl more than any other aspect of his education. He could accept that democracy might have certain advantages over German authoritarianism. He could acknowledge that American constitutional design contained sophisticated protections against tyranny. But the suggestion that National Socialism shared fundamental characteristics with the Soviet system that Germany was fighting seemed like intellectual dishonesty designed to discredit German achievements. Yet Dr. Sullivan supported her claims with evidence rather than rhetoric. She quoted German laws that eliminated judicial independence. She cited statistics on political imprisonment that paralleled Soviet practices. She analyzed propaganda techniques that employed identical methods of emotional manipulation and factual distortion. The evidence was overwhelming, and Karl found himself unable to refute it through reasoned argument. One afternoon in June, after a particularly challenging lecture on the mechanisms of totalitarian control, Karl approached Dr. Sullivan with a question that had been forming for months. "If what you say is true," he asked in his improving English, "why do the Americans invest so much in educating prisoners? Why teach us to think critically if it makes us more dangerous when we return to Germany?" Dr. Sullivan looked at him with an expression that combined sympathy with conviction. "Because," she replied, "the Americans believe that education makes people less dangerous, not more. Ignorant people are easy to manipulate, easy to recruit for destructive causes, easy to convince that their enemies are subhuman. Educated people ask questions, demand evidence, and resist simplistic explanations. The Americans are betting that educated Germans will rebuild a better Germany after the war, one that doesn't require another generation to die on battlefields." The answer reframed everything Karl had experienced since his capture. The education program was not propaganda designed to weaken German morale. It was a systematic investment in post-war rehabilitation based on the optimistic premise that minds could change, that former enemies could become future allies, and that education represented the best defense against the ideologies that had produced the war. Karl spent that evening in the camp library, surrounded by books that represented countless hours of human intellectual achievement. He selected a volume of Immanuel Kant's philosophical writings and read the famous essay What is Enlightenment?, where the German philosopher argued that enlightenment was humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity, the courage to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. The irony was exquisite. An American prison camp was teaching captured German soldiers to think for themselves using texts written by German philosophers. The education program embodied Kant's ideal of enlightenment, encouraging prisoners to question authority, examine evidence, and reach independent conclusions through reason rather than obedience. Karl had entered military service believing that obedience was the highest virtue, that questioning orders represented weakness, and that individual judgment mattered less than collective discipline. The Luftwaffe had reinforced these values through training that rewarded compliance and punished independence. But the American education program taught the opposite lesson, that individual thought was valuable, that questioning assumptions was necessary, and that intellectual independence strengthened rather than weakened communities. The contrast revealed competing visions of human potential. National Socialist ideology assumed that most people needed strong leadership because they lacked capacity for self-governance. Democratic theory assumed that most people could govern themselves if given education, opportunity, and institutional support. The difference was not merely political but philosophical, reflecting fundamentally different beliefs about human nature and social possibility. By autumn 1944, Karl had been a prisoner for 15 months and a student for 12. He had completed courses in quantum mechanics, English language, democratic political theory, and European history. He had read books that had been banned in Germany, studied with professors who had fled German persecution, and encountered ideas that contradicted everything his education had taught him about politics, society, and truth. The accumulated effect was transformative in ways that extended far beyond academic knowledge. Karl had entered captivity as a loyal German officer who believed in National Socialist principles. He was becoming someone who questioned those principles not from disloyalty but from intellectual honesty, someone who recognized that loyalty to truth might sometimes require disloyalty to the regime that had demanded his unthinking obedience. The transformation accelerated in October when Karl enrolled in a philosophy course taught by Father Thomas O'Brien, a Jesuit priest from Boston College who had volunteered to provide instruction to German prisoners. Father O'Brien was 68 years old, fluent in Latin, Greek, and German, and convinced that philosophy offered tools for examining life's fundamental questions with rigor that neither dogma nor propaganda could provide. The course focused on ethics, exploring how different philosophical traditions had approached questions of right action, moral obligation, and human flourishing. Father O'Brien assigned readings from Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, and Mill, representing virtue ethics, natural law theory, deontological ethics, and utilitarianism. Each tradition offered different frameworks for thinking about morality, and each revealed limitations in the others. But the most profound lessons emerged not from ancient texts but from contemporary application. Father O'Brien devoted several weeks to examining moral questions raised by modern warfare, occupation policies, and treatment of civilian populations. He presented case studies drawn from actual events, asking students to analyze them through different ethical frameworks and defend their conclusions through reasoned argument. One case study particularly challenged Karl's remaining assumptions. Father O'Brien described a hypothetical scenario where military commanders must decide whether to bomb a city containing both legitimate military targets and civilian populations. Utilitarian ethics might justify the bombing if military advantage outweighed civilian casualties. Deontological ethics might prohibit it because deliberately killing innocents violated categorical imperatives against using people merely as means to ends. Virtue ethics might ask what kind of person or society would choose such action and whether it reflected human excellence or degradation. The discussion grew heated as students defended conflicting positions. Some argued that military necessity justified civilian deaths if targets possessed genuine strategic value. Others insisted that deliberately targeting civilians violated moral absolutes that no military advantage could override. Still others questioned whether the distinction between military and civilian targets remained meaningful in total war where entire economies supported military operations. Karl found himself unable to choose a position with confidence. Every framework seemed to contain partial truth while missing something essential. Utilitarianism captured the reality that consequences mattered but struggled to explain why some actions felt wrong regardless of outcomes. Deontological ethics honored moral absolutes but sometimes led to conclusions that seemed impractical or even cruel. Virtue ethics emphasized character but provided limited guidance for specific choices. Father O'Brien observed the confusion with evident satisfaction. "Good," he said when the discussion concluded. "You are discovering that ethics is difficult, that moral certainty is often unwarranted, and that reasonable people can disagree about profound questions. This is the beginning of wisdom. Beware anyone who offers you simple answers to complex moral problems. They are either fools or liars." The warning resonated with Karl's growing recognition that National Socialist ideology had offered precisely such simple answers. Germany good, enemies bad. Aryans superior, others inferior. Obedience virtuous, questioning treasonous. The simplicity had been seductive, providing clear guidance in a complex world. But the cost of that simplicity was moral blindness to the catastrophes it enabled. That evening, Karl wrote a letter to his younger sister Anna, who remained in Stuttgart working in a munitions factory. The letter was carefully worded to pass American censorship while conveying truths he needed to share. "I am learning," he wrote, "that many things we believed with certainty were based on assumptions we never examined. The Americans have given me books, teachers, and time to think about questions I never knew to ask. When the war ends and I return home, I will be a different person than the brother you remember. I hope you will still recognize me." The letter would reach Anna in December, carried through Red Cross channels to a Germany that was rapidly collapsing under Allied pressure. She would read it in a basement shelter while American bombs fell on Stuttgart, and she would wonder what kind of education could make a German officer sound so much like a stranger to his own country. Winter brought the final phase of Karl's educational transformation. In January 1945, he enrolled in an advanced seminar on post-war reconstruction that brought together insights from all his previous courses. The seminar was taught collaboratively by 3 instructors representing different disciplines. Dr. Hartmann provided scientific and technical perspective. Professor Cohen addressed political and institutional challenges. Dr. Sullivan contributed historical analysis of previous reconstruction efforts after major conflicts. The seminar operated on graduate school principles, requiring students to research topics independently, present findings to peers, and defend conclusions through evidence-based argument. Karl chose to study agricultural reconstruction in post-war Germany, examining how scientific farming methods could help rebuild devastated rural economies. The research required him to master new material and soil chemistry, agricultural economics, and rural sociology while synthesizing knowledge from his physics background. The project revealed connections between seemingly unrelated fields. Physics principles explain fertilizer chemistry. Economic theory illuminated market mechanisms for distributing agricultural surplus. Political science addressed how land reform policies could either strengthen or undermine democratic development. The interdisciplinary synthesis demonstrated that complex problems required multiple perspectives and collaborative expertise rather than simple ideological solutions. Karl presented his research to the seminar in March 1945, delivering a 40-minute lecture in English that outlined a comprehensive approach to German agricultural rehabilitation. He proposed applying American techniques for soil conservation, mechanization, and cooperative organization while adapting them to European conditions and cultural traditions. The presentation combined scientific rigor with practical wisdom, theoretical knowledge with implementation planning. Dr. Hartmann praised the work as graduate-level scholarship that would be worthy of publication in academic journals after the war. But the real significance was personal rather than professional. Karl had transformed from a fighter pilot who knew how to destroy targets into a scholar who understood how to rebuild societies. The education program had given him not just knowledge but a new identity, a sense of purpose that extended beyond military service into civilian contribution. By April 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final weeks. American and Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from east and west. German resistance was collapsing under overwhelming Allied superiority. The thousand-year Reich that Karl had believed would reshape Europe was dying in rubble and defeat. Yet inside Camp Indiantown Gap, 300 German prisoners sat in classrooms studying subjects that would matter after the fighting stopped. Karl received news of Germany's surrender on May 8 while working on a final examination in his philosophy course. The announcement came during lunch, delivered by camp loudspeakers in both English and German. Around him, prisoners responded with mixed emotions. Some wept from relief that the killing had ended. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of total defeat. A few expressed anger at the surrender, convinced that Germany could have fought longer if leadership had remained resolute. Karl felt primarily exhaustion, as if a tremendous weight he had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything he had fought for had ended in failure. Yet somehow he did not feel defeated. The education he had received during captivity had given him resources for understanding and processing events that mere ideology could never have provided. That evening, Father O'Brien organized a voluntary discussion session for prisoners who wanted to talk about the surrender and what it meant for their futures. About 40 men attended, filling a classroom that had hosted countless lectures on subjects ranging from mathematics to literature. The mood was somber but not despairing, reflective rather than resentful. What happens now, Father O'Brien asked the group, depends on what you choose to do with the education you have received here. You can return to Germany bitter about defeat and determined to revive the ideologies that produced this catastrophe. Or you can return as educated men committed to building something better. The choice is yours, but the consequences will affect millions of people who had no choice in the matter. Karl knew which path he would choose. The education program had given him tools for thinking critically, evidence for questioning propaganda, and hope that human beings could learn from catastrophic mistakes. He would return to Germany as someone committed to reconstruction rather than revenge, to building democratic institutions rather than reviving authoritarian traditions, to using his education for creating abundance rather than perfecting destruction. The following months brought administrative processing as American authorities prepared for mass prisoner repatriation. But the education program continued operating until the final prisoners departed. Classes met as scheduled. Examinations were administered as planned. Certificates were awarded to students who completed courses successfully. The Americans maintained academic standards even as the military rationale for the program evaporated with the war's end. Karl completed his final course, an advanced seminar in constitutional design, in August 1945. He received a certificate signed by all three instructors, documenting his successful completion of university-level work in physics, political science, history, philosophy, and economics. The certificate had no official standing with German authorities, but it represented something more valuable than formal credentials. It was evidence that he had used his captivity for growth rather than mere survival, for learning rather than simply waiting. On September 22, 1945, Karl Richter boarded a transport ship in New York Harbor bound for Bremerhaven with 2,000 other German prisoners. He carried minimal personal possessions but a substantial intellectual cargo. Textbooks purchased with his prisoner wages. Notebooks filled with lecture notes and reading reflections. Letters of recommendation from American professors who believed he had potential to contribute meaningfully to post-war reconstruction. Most importantly, he carried a transformed understanding of politics, society, and human possibility that would shape everything he did for the rest of his life. The ship departed at dawn, sliding past the Statue of Liberty as morning light illuminated the New York skyline. Karl stood at the rail watching America recede into the distance, knowing he was leaving the place where he had been captured but also liberated, imprisoned but also educated, defeated but also redeemed. The paradoxes no longer troubled him. He had learned that life contained contradictions that could not be resolved through ideology but only navigated through wisdom. Germany appeared on the horizon 12 days later, a coastline obscured by fog and the smoke of still-burning cities. Karl had left this country as a confident young pilot convinced of German superiority and destined victory. He returned as a scholar who understood that nations were neither superior nor inferior but simply different, that victory and defeat mattered less than what societies learned from success or failure, and that education represented the only reliable path from catastrophe toward reconstruction. The years that followed tested everything Karl had learned during his captivity. He found work with British occupation authorities translating agricultural documents and teaching scientific farming methods to German farmers whose lands had been devastated by war. He enrolled at the University of Tübingen to complete the engineering degree interrupted by military conscription, applying credits from his American prison camp education toward graduation requirements. He married Elizabeth Kaufmann, a teacher who had survived the bombing of Dresden and shared his commitment to building democratic institutions in post-war Germany. Together they raised 3 children in a Germany transformed by defeat into something its pre-war leadership never imagined possible. A democratic republic with protected civil liberties. A federal system with separated powers. A constitution designed to prevent the concentration of authority that had enabled dictatorship. The Germany that emerged from occupation incorporated many principles Karl had first encountered in American prison camp classrooms. In 1952, Karl accepted a position with the German Ministry of Agriculture, developing policies for rural modernization that drew heavily on techniques he had studied during his captivity. His work helped transform West German agriculture from subsistence farming into productive efficiency that supported economic recovery. He published papers in agricultural journals, lectured at universities, and served on government committees addressing questions of sustainable development decades before the term became fashionable. But his most important contribution came through teaching. In 1961, Karl joined the faculty at the Technical University of Munich, where he taught agricultural engineering to students who had no memory of the war that had shaped their country's recent history. He spoke rarely about his own military service but often about his education in American captivity, describing it as the experience that had taught him to think critically, question assumptions, and recognize that enemies could become teachers if one had courage to learn from them. Karl lived to be 89 years old, teaching until the year before his death in 2006. His funeral was attended by over 400 people, including former students who had become leaders in German agriculture, American scholars he had collaborated with on research projects, and fellow prisoners who had shared his classroom experiences 6 decades earlier. The eulogy was delivered by his daughter Maria, who read from her father's letters describing his first quantum mechanics lecture in an American prison camp. He wrote that he entered that classroom as a soldier trained for destruction and emerged as a student prepared for reconstruction, she told the mourners. The Americans gave him books when he expected bars, professors when he expected punishment, education when he expected only to wait for war's end. He spent the rest of his life trying to give others what he received, the gift of knowledge that liberates minds even when bodies are confined. Karl Richter's gravestone in the Munich Forest Cemetery bears an inscription in both German and English, languages that represented the dual identity he had forged from defeat and education. Scholar, teacher, builder. He learned from his enemies and taught his friends. Sometimes the greatest victories come from accepting that we lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.